Greetings, lovely players of Hearthstone. I'm FaZe, and today we're back with another Hearthstone Whispers of the Old Gods review video. The format's going to be the same as last time and the time before, where we take a look at a card, make some notable observations about it, and then try to assess whether the card is viable in Standard, Wild, or in the Arena, where applicable, of course. And yeah, that's about it. Let's get right into the cards. The first card we have for today is the Rogue 6-mana rare spell Thistle Tea. Draw a card, add 2 extra copies of it to your hand. Now, the closest thing to this, I believe, is the Druid spell Nourish. Aside from the fact that they're both epic, they both draw 3 cards. So, my thoughts on this card are that it's not really that good. And I'll give you the reasons why. First of all, it's 1 mana more than Nourish, which is kind of okay, just because Nourish is bad because Druid doesn't have a lot of ways to come back onto the board. So if you play Nourish, you kind of can't recover the tempo from it. Rogue is a lot better at tempoing out than Druid is, for the most part. So for that reason, that 1 mana is not like the hugest deal, but it's still pretty big. Also, this card is very RNG, I think. The way Hearthstone card draw works is that the more, or card draw in card games in general, is that the more cards you draw, the more consistent your game plan becomes. Just because you cycle through more and more of your deck, and whenever you draw like a single card, you are that much more likely to have the minion or spell that you need in any given situation. So Thistle Tea doesn't really actually do that because you draw only 1 card, so it doesn't help with the consistency of your plan. That's another reason I don't like it. The third one is it really gives away too much information about your hand. Aside from the fact that the copied spells will probably read copied by Thistle Tea, the way Thought-Stealed cards do, your opponent can very easily keep track of what Thistle Tea copied. So for example, if you copy an Eviscerate, maybe I just don't play 4 health minions, if I have the option, of course. With that all being said, I don't really like the card too much. I think it's okay, but it's not that great. It will definitely see some play in the experimentation phase of the expansion, but I don't think it will survive the transition. Definitely not playable in Wild just because Wild is way too fast of a format for this card. Maybe in something like Mill Rogue, but Mill Rogue is sometimes not even... the deck is not even fast enough for Wild sometimes. And this is an even slower card than something like Vanish. But it does fit the Mill Rogue quite well. So maybe it'll see play there. Other than that though, not playable in Wild. In Standard, again, it will see play during the experimentation phase, but I'm pretty sure it will be phased out after that. Just because Rogue as a class doesn't have a lot of defensive tools. They're very good at tempoing out, but not that great at prolonging the game to the late stages and surviving, because their hero power doesn't enable that as well. And in the Arena, it's akin to Sprint. Sprint is a pretty good card in Arena for Rogue, just because Rogues in Arena tend to be very low curve. And also the RNG is somewhat mitigated in Arena, just because you generally are going to hit a minion with this. So it doesn't matter as much if you hit like a 2-drop or a 3-drop, for example. Yeah, it matters slightly, but it's still card advantage. So the RNG is slightly mitigated. It's an okay card in Arena. It's up there with Sprint. So that's it for Thistle Tea. We have the next card, Twilight Summoner, 4 mana, 1/1 epic. Deathrattle, summon a 5/5 Faceless Destroyer. Another somewhat underwhelming card, pardon me. The problem with this card is it's way too slow. That's simply what it is. You can look at it as a 4 mana, what is it, 6/6? That's not really a correct way to look at it. The issue with this card is that it takes 2/3 turns, depending on how you look at it, to get full value out of this. Because you play this on 4, then you have to... Your opponent's not going to kill this. So you're going to have to trade into something. Presumably that thing is not going to die because this is a 1/1. So that's what you're doing on your turn 5. And then you get to attack on turn 6. So by turn 6, the 5/5 is much less relevant. Although still relevant to a certain degree. You have your Shield Maidens, Sylvanuses, Emperor Thorisons that this trades into, but it's just way too slow to get going, I believe. You can compare this to something like Nerubian Egg. The issue, like the difference being that this guy can attack on his own, whereas you need to buff the Nerubian Egg. But you still want to buff this guy when you attack. Otherwise, he's really not impactful the first 2 turns that he's on the board. So it's just not that great. That's about it, really. It's just way too slow of a card. In Standard, again, probably going to see some experimentation, but I don't hold my breath. I don't think this will be something that survives the experimentation phase. In Wild, this is absolutely too slow. You're often dead by turn 5, 6. Not often, but it sometimes happens. And this is just way too slow to play. You play this, your opponent's just going to hit you in the face for 6 damage, then what do? Right? And in the arena, I think it's still a slightly slow card. It depends on the type of deck that you have. If you have like a lot of board clears, you can make this guy work. But in Arena, it's playable. It's definitely playable in Arena, simply for the fact that many epics are just straight up horrible in Arena, and this is an epic that is sometimes okay. So yeah, that's about it for Twilight Summoner. Slightly underwhelming card, but we can live with it. Next card we have is Embrace the Shadow. Priest, 2 mana, epic spell. This turn, your healing effects deal damage instead. So, it's just basically an Arakkoa Soul Priest without the body, right? And it lasts only for 1 turn, obviously. I've seen a lot of people be upset about this card, that it's like too situational, but I really don't think so. Yes, it is situational, but just think about how many times you play Arakkoa just to nuke it for 4 damage with Circle of Healing. Circle of Healing is basically most of the reason that you play Arakkoa anyway. So Embrace the Shadow gives you that effect 2 turns earlier, which is very powerful. Or it doesn't even have to be 2 turns earlier, but it gives you the same effect for 2 less mana, which is pretty powerful, I think. So I definitely think that this will see play, at least as a 1-of. It just improves the consistency of the Circle of Healing board clear by so much, just because you can put like a 3rd and 4th Arakkoa into your deck. Do you want to put a 4th one? Maybe not. But I think just having one of these cards is a very, very good way to make Circle of Healing more consistent. And that's funny because the card is situational, but it actually makes your board clear more consistent, and I really like that. Definitely going to see some play in Wild and in Standard, I believe. Definitely as a 1-of. We'll have to test it out and see if 2 are actually too much. Maybe they're not if you're running lots of things like Flash Heal, Light of the Naru, if you're still playing Wild. So yeah, all in all, it's a pretty good card. I like it. Definitely a 1-of in most control-oriented Priest decks. Also in Freeze Priest, quote-unquote Freeze Priest, basically combo Priest with like Flash Heals and Prophet Valens and Alexstrasza's and all that. This is a very good way to enable your burn for a lot cheaper. So there's something to be said about that as well. Very strong card. Expected to see play across both Standard and Wild. Not in the Arena though. In Arena, you cannot get this off. Same as with... That's why actually you don't pick Circle of Healing in Arena, right? Because you can't get it off that often. Same thing with this card. It doesn't... You can't rely on the combo in Arena. So don't pick this guy in Arena. Moving on, we have a Deathwing Dragonlord, 10 mana, 12/12. Deathrattle, put all dragons from your hand into the battlefield. Okay, so like the original Deathwing, this guy... Really? I don't... No. Sorry about that. Like the original Deathwing, this guy is a very all-in card. And here's why. First of all, it's a 10 mana 12/12 that doesn't impact the board immediately. Yeah, it's a super big body, but it's not going to prevent your opponent from like having lethal. Second of all, this card is still weak to like silence-based removal, stuff like Entomb, stuff like Polymorph and Hex. And I do think with the very strong cards that mid-range Shaman is getting, Hex will make a comeback, basically, because it's a very good card, very good removal. Same goes for Polymorph. Polymorph slightly less so, but I think the metagame might be slow enough for you to justify running at least one Polymorph in your deck. And a tube is always going to be a tube of, for the most part, in Priest. So, just because of those cards existing, Deathwing Dragonlord is substantially less good. Second, you would like to imagine that when you kill Deathwing with, like, kill removal, something like Execute. Right? Something like Execute, something like a big game. That you would flood the board with like these huge minions like Alexstrasza, Cro-Magus, Ysera, and all that. But the reality is, you can only fit so many big minions into your deck because Deathwing is already a huge minion. So, more often than not, you're going to be getting small things. Right? You're going to be getting, for example, Azure Drakes, Twilight Guardians, Twilight Drakes if you're running that, depending on what kind of dragon build you have going for you. Maybe Chillmaw. Who knows? Maybe you're running Chillmaw. But those are not really that impactful. And on top of that, on average, I think you're going to get 2 dragons with Deathwing Dragonlord, because it's very rare that you have that many dragons in your hand currently. Also, many dragons have battle cries. For example, you lose the draw card from Azure Drake, you lose the health on Twilight Drake, you lose the 2, like the 3 attack and the taunt on Twilight Guardian. You lose the battle cry of Alexstrasza if you're running that. You guys get my point. And also, on top of that, you lose all potential holding dragon synergies for the future. So, for example, if you had a Blackwing Corruptor in your hand, that's no longer useful just because Deathwing brought out all the dragons in your hand. So for all those reasons, I just think Deathwing is not that great. That's all there is to it, really. Definitely too slow to see play in Wild. In Standard, again, probably gonna see some experimentation because he's a cool dude. Obviously, it's a very cool card, but again, probably not going to survive the experimentation phase of the game for all the reasons that I just listed. And in the arena, it's okay. In arena, it's 10 mana 12/12. Often in the arena, you can play a really big minion, which is okay. And you know, Azure Drake is a very good card. Dragon Consort is a very good card. Twilight, well, not that good, but maybe you have enough dragons. Who knows? My point is, some of the dragons are pretty good in arena, so the Deathrattle is somewhat likely to get you something. So, yeah, he's an okay guy in arena. Depends on what he's put up against. Next, we have the Faceless Summoner, 6 mana 5/5 mage, common. Battlecry, summon a random 3-cost minion. I don't really know how to evaluate this card. Like, just because of pure stats, this guy's insane. Like, if you look at all the 3-drops, most of them are not really that bad. Like, yeah, you could get a 2/2. So you get a 6 mana 5/5 and a 2/2. Is that bad? Not really. It's not great, but it's not bad. You could get like Bran. You could get, most of the time you're gonna average around a 3/3. Just because, well, you are gonna average a 3/3. That's just most 3-drops are fairly consistent, is what I'm trying to say. So just because of that, I think this is obviously it's an insane card in Arena, right? Let's just get the obvious out of the way. This guy is superb in Arena, okay? But in Constructed, is it good enough? Are like the stats on the card, are they good enough to justify removing synergies from your deck? Because Constructed is a lot more synergy and combo oriented, because you have the freedom to do that. So are the stats that you gain from this guy good enough to justify replacing some card with a lot better potential synergy? Maybe. If it is actually good enough, this is a card that, if it's good enough to be played, it's going to be played everywhere for the most part. And if it's not good enough to be played, it'll be played nowhere. That's and that actually sounds weird, but basically if this guy is good enough because he's good across the board, he will be played in every single mage deck that is not Freeze Mage, for example. And if he's bad, as in not good enough, you know, just by pure stats, then he just won't. It's as simple as that. I can't really make the assessment of whether or not it will be good enough. Like, the stats are a lot, but I really don't know whether or not it's the stats justify you know, losing potential synergies with some other cards you might play in your mage deck instead, because mage decks are very synergistic. You have, if you look at the mage class, you have the Sorcerer's Apprentice, right? You have the Sorcerer's Apprentice, which synergizes very well. You have the Flame Waker, especially Tempo Mage. There's a lot of synergies across the board. So we'll just have to wait and see. Definitely an insane card in Arena, though. Next card we have is Servant of Yogg-Saron, another mage card. 5 mana, 5/4 rare. Cast a random spell that costs 5 or less. Targets chosen randomly. So just like Yogg-Saron, it chooses targets randomly. The thing is, though, this guy is way too random for it to be good. It's a random spell with a random target. So the spell is random and the target is random. And it's not enough spells like Yogg-Saron for it to be even remotely consistent, right? Because Yogg-Saron is somewhat consistent in what he does, because there's so many spells that get played. This guy is not. This guy can lay in hands your opponent, or Holy Light your opponent, for example. Or he can Pyroblast your opponent, or he can Polymorph Ysera, right? It's just way too random to be any good, I believe. In Standard and Wild. In the Arena, sometimes you're going to be forced to pick this, but I don't think you're going to be too happy either, because if you're a good Arena player, you want your draft to be consistent, and this is a very swingy card. It basically wins or loses you the game in a way that you have no control over. For example, something like Mad Bomber in Arena, it's RNG, but you get to control somewhat the RNG. This guy, you don't get to control anything. It either, you know, wins you the game or loses you the game. And obviously the body on it is pretty weak, so I don't think it is a great pick in Arena as well. Next we have the Shadowcaster. This is one of the more interesting cards, actually, of the ones that have been revealed in the past week. It's a rogue card, 5 mana, 4/4. Epic Rogue Minion. Battlecry, choose a friendly minion, add a 1/1 copy to your hand that costs 1. So, the things that you want to play with this card are 3 types of minions. You want to play minions with very good battle cries, or combos, minions with very good death rattles, or minions that provide some sort of buff to your board. So that could be something like Azure Drake. It gives you spell damage, and it's a battle cry, so Azure Drake is very, very good. Or something like Stormwind Champion, believe it or not, is really good. Just because it's a thing that has immediate impact, and it gives some consistent buff on the board. Also, things like Ragnaros, obviously, are very good with this. If you get a 1-mana 1/1 Rag, that's insane. Okay, so you guys get my point. Also, I think there might be enough like Deathrattle oriented cards in Rogue that it actually might be viable to play like a Undercity Huckster, Raptor, mid-range-ish kind of Rogue. So that's what I tried to do, and I made this deck. Bing! So let's take a look at the deck. I spent like a little over 15 minutes trying to iron out the kinks in the deck, and I think I have it to a very consistent state so far. Obviously, there are going to be improvements that could be made over this, but this will just serve as an illustration as to how the card performs. So you obviously have your backstabs, you have your preparations, your deadlies. Those are all very core to Rogue. Preparations slightly less so because this deck doesn't run sprints. Just because if you play between Undercity Huckster and Loot Hoarder and the Unearthed Raptor and Zeril potentially, I don't know if Zeril fits the deck, but it's just serves an illustration point. Between all those cards, and between the Shadowcaster, which is also a card draw, which is actually very comparable to actually Azure Drake, because it shares the same stat line and kind of draws you a card. Kind of. It's conditional because you have to have the board somewhat, but moving on from that. You have the Fan of Knives that synergize with your Drakes, the Edwin, which sometimes wins you the game, SI7, like if Edwin is very good with Shadowcaster, just because if Edwin is a 1-mana 1/1, that actually makes him better, because he's more easy to combo and he just loses 1/1's worth of stats. SI7 agents are really good with the card because, again, they're combos. Tomb Pillagers and Zeril are probably one of the weaker ones. Tomb Pillagers specifically because the coin is not that impactful. You're basically playing a 1-mana 1/1 that draws you a coin when it dies, so it's kind of like a Wisp, but it's a delayed Wisp, so maybe one of the flex slots in the deck. Who knows? Azure Drake is very good. It gives you the spell damage. It gives you the card draw. Thaurissan is very good. If you get it, you're mostly playing Thaurissan for this ability anyway. Sylvanas and Rag, obviously very good cards with Shadowcaster. And there's like so many synergies that interweave within this deck that it actually might be good enough, I believe. Like Shadowcaster is, I think, actually good enough to see a decent amount of play even after the experimentation phase of the expansion passes. Just because when I look at this deck, I look at it like a good mid-range deck. I believe I can play this and get Legend in Standard at least. Obviously, in Wild, it's a pretty slow card. It depends. It could fit again into a Mill Rogue with something like Cold Light, because you're mostly pardon my spelling errors, because you're mostly playing Cold Light for the ability anyway. But yeah, probably not going to see too much play in Wild just because of its slowness. In Standard, though, I mean, again, when I look at this deck, I see a pretty good deck. Like, there are some improvements that can be made to it, but this is a Legend-worthy deck for the most part. And for that reason, I think Shadowcaster will see a fair amount of play in Standard. And in the Arena, it's probably not good enough, just because in Arena, you mostly, again, get minions. So it's kind of like get a 1-mana 1/1 minion of your choice. There's not really that many crazy minions in Arena, and for that reason, I don't think... I just think this will be another poor epic in the Arena. Okay, so next card we have the Forlorn Stalker, 3 mana, 4/2 Hunter rare. Battlecry, give all Deathrattle minions in your hand +1/+1. Okay, so let's see what Deathrattle minions are in the game. So, Haunted Creeper is pretty good, right? Scientist is pretty good. Egg is pretty good. I mean, I don't know why you would play Egg in Hunter, but I mean, maybe you make it work. I don't know. Harvest Golem is actually pretty good. The reason that Harvest Golem doesn't see play in Hunter is that is just because they have way too many 3-drops. It's not that Harvest Golem in itself is a bad card, but you actually want to look at the Deathrattle minions that follow up to this guy. So things like Shredder are very good. Things like even Mechanical Yeti, again, very good. Belcher, lovely. Sylvanas, why not? Cairn, God forbid. Sky Golem is really good. Highmane is also very good with this, if you look at it. Right? So there's a lot of good cards. The problem is, most of those cards are leaving the rotation, and for that reason this card will not be good, I don't think, in Standard. Yes, you can use it with cards like Infest, but Infest on its own is not a very good card, so you don't want a situational combo card with Infest. Also, there is the caveat of this buffing only minions in your hand and not in your deck at all, so you have to curve out perfectly for this to be good. So you have to curve out perfectly, and they have to be Deathrattle minions. That's kind of hard to achieve. But I think there are enough Deathrattle minions in Standard, in mid-range Hunter, that you can actually make this work. In Wild. What am I talking about? One card that I compare this to, and this may be a really weird comparison, is sort of Justice. It's kind of like the same thing, except it only hits Deathrattle minions, but the drawback is not as big. Right, you get a 4/2, whereas Sword of Justice is a huge tempo loss. Yeah, that's about it for the card. Gonna be pretty interesting in Wild. I think it might be good enough to play in Wild, and that's saying a lot because Wild is really, really, like, the power level over there is just insane. But if you curve into like Shredder, into Belcher, into Highmane, it's really good. It's really good. And even if you play like 2/2 drops after that, because you top deck them on turn 3 and 4, right? It's still very good. So I think it's good enough to see play in Wild. Too situational in Standard though. And in the arena, depends on how many Deathrattles you have. If you have 10 Deathrattles, this guy is very good, because you don't lose that many stats for the effect. And if you don't, it's kind of like a Jungle Panther that is not a beast and does not have stealth, which is pretty bad. But hey, you guys are good enough at Arena that you can make the assessment for yourself, whether or not your deck has enough or not as much Deathrattles. Moving on, we have the Demented Frostcaller. This guy is so hard to evaluate, it's not even funny. So we have a 4 mana 2/4 rare mage card, minion specifically. After you cast a spell, freeze a random enemy character. Okay, so we have like a similar card, and some people may look weirdly on this, but I think Flamewaker is a pretty apt comparison. Now, because like the body's the same, the effect is sort of the same in that it tempos out your opponent, right? Flamewaker kills stuff and deals damage. This guy, again, removes your opponent's tempo. So they kind of serve the same purpose. But, like, the 4 mana 2/4 body is just so horrible that it makes me think the card is bad. Yet again, the effect is so powerful in Mage just because of the amount of cheap spells you have that is really good. So I think we're gonna have to see through experimentation whether or not this card is good enough. Something to note is that this guy can actually will not freeze the same enemy twice. So for example, if you play, let's say, if there's like 2 minions on the board, and then you Arcane Missiles and you Mirror Image, it will not freeze the same minion twice the second time you cast a spell. Or basically what I'm saying is, you guys get what I'm saying. It's not gonna like dud at any point. So it can also freeze face, which is arguably good or bad. It's probably around 10% worse that it can freeze face. But it still has its uses just because you can freeze Warrior, Hunter, and Paladin, which is pretty nice. Again, though, the 4 mana 2/4 stat line is just so poor. But still, I mean, so many cheap spells. Look at this. Right? So many cheap spells. You have this, you have the Frostbolts, you have Arcane Explosion, God forbid. You have Portal in Wild. There's this guy has very high potential, I believe. And we'll just have to see whether it's playable in the constructed formats. In the arena, though, this is a pretty bad card just because you're not guaranteed to get spells at any point. Yes, Mage has a lot of spells, but many of them are underwhelming in the arena, right? For example, Icelands, you can't build a combo around it. Mirror Image is kind of it's a very good tempo card, but sometimes your deck is not going that way. So in arena, it's pretty bad. And in the constructed, it's so polarizing that I really can't give an opinion on this card, like, at all. It's ridiculous how tough. We just have to play test this card and see how it performs. Next card we have is Shifting Shade, a 4 mana 4/3 priest rare minion. Deathrattle, copy a card from your opponent's deck and add it to your hand. So there's a very similar effect to this that actually already exists in the game, which is, drumroll please, Thoughtsteal. Now, it's 1 card less than Thoughtsteal, but you get a 4/3, but it's 1 more mana. So it's kind of weird. Thoughtsteal is actually a very playable card in Control Priest, just because it lets you win control matchups that often go to Fatigue. This guy does not draw from your deck, it copies from your opponent's deck, so that's very aligned with the Fatigue late game Priest plan. So that's already pretty good. Also, it's a lot less RNG than Thoughtsteal, because Thoughtsteal gives you 2 random cards. This is always going to be a 4/3. It somewhat depends whether, like, how relevant the body is, right? But just because Thoughtsteal is playable, it's a playable card, this makes Shifting Shade automatically playable as well. At least in my opinion. Right? If you're running Thoughtsteals in your deck and you need more Thoughtsteal kind of effects, you can always put this in as like a redundancy factor. And if you want less if you want less Thoughtsteal effects, then you can just put 2 Shifting Shades in your deck. So it's very flexible, and I like that. And Thoughtsteal, again, is a very playable card in control matchups. And again, standard is going to be a bit slower, so maybe more control matchups. And I assume this guy will see a fair amount of play. Also, fair amount of play in Wild as well, just because Thoughtsteal is currently being played in Wild, so why not this guy, right? In the arena, though, I don't think it's really that good, just because what you want to do with Priest in arena is that you want to get a minion onto the board that survives, right? Because if a minion on the board survives, then your hero power becomes insane. Otherwise, your hero power is just stupid and doesn't do anything. So this guy doesn't fit that game plan. In arena with Priest, you kind of want to tempo out. You kind of want to buff things. This guy's a weak body. It's very easily traded into by a 3/2, which are very common in arena. So I just don't think in Arena, as a priest, you can recover from the tempo loss that you get from this. Maybe you could, in the right circumstances. Maybe you have like 2 Excavated Evils in your deck and a Light Bomb or something. But that's going to be pretty rare. I don't think this is going to be a prime Arena pick as a default card. Okay, so next we have the Twilight Flamecaller, a 3-mana 2/2 mage minion. A battle cry, deal 1 damage to all enemy minions. So it's kind of like a 2/2 that has Arcane Explosion slapped onto it, right? Arcane Explosion is worth around 1.5 mana, I believe, as an effect, but you can't really cost it at 1.5, so it's costed at 2. And there's the fact that it's lumped onto a minion, which makes it better. When spell effects are actually combined and put on minions, that actually makes the spell itself more flexible and straight up better for the most part. So you can look at this as like, and that effect is worth around half a mana, I would say. So you can look at this as a 1-mana 2/2 for the most part. It's not as good. It's not as good as the Warrior common card, the Ravaging Ghoul, the 3-mana 3/3 that whirlwinds the board as a battle cry. Just because, like, the 1/1 loss on stats are not good enough to offset the fact that this is that you know, you whirlwind your own board. I don't think, at least. So it's worse card. It's a worse card in that way, but I still think this is a very, very playable card. It deals very well with muster for battles, with implosions, right? Wow. I am really off my game today. Sorry about that, guys. Implosion. There you go. So, just because of that, I expect this guy to see a fair amount of play in Wild. Just because there's so many Deathrattles in Wild. There's so many 1/1s. They're Haunted Creeper, right? Creeper's a 2-mana 1/2 that spawns 2 1/1 Spectral Spiders. There's a lot of things. There's a lot of 1 health tokens in Wild. So for that reason, I think this will see a fair amount of play in Wild. In Standard, not so much. Standard is going to be a bit chunkier, you know, as far as minions go. I expect to see a lot more Druid-esque type of decks that play mid-range minions. So this guy will be a lot less impactful in Standard. And in the Arena, it's a pretty good card. It's you have to, again, look at your deck and see how the numbers work. For example, if you have a lot of 2/3s in the Arena, that means that this guy is a lot better because your 2/3 can trade into your opponent's 2/3 and you can play this. And now you have a 2/1 and a 2/2, right? So there's all sorts of stuff to consider, but as a baseline card, it's pretty good in Arena. I like it. Also, people are getting used to the fact to playing against Mage, basically. And one of the things that you can do versus Mage is overload their hero power. And by that, I mean, you can set up the board in such a way that 2 minions are left with 1 health, and they cannot ping both of them. This fixes that. So I think it's a pretty good card in Arena. Definitely above average. Definitely above average. It's, if you see this card, you should strongly consider it, I believe. Next card we have is Princess Huhuran. I have no idea how that's pronounced. I'm sure I'm butchering it, and I'm sure I will get called out for it. But for all intents and purposes, it's Princess Huhuran. 5-mana 6/5 Hunter Beast Legendary. The battle cry, trigger a friendly minion's Deathrattle effect immediately. The card is very strong, I think. It is very, very strong because it's a 5-mana 6/5, so you don't sacrifice any stats on it. It's basically a flip pit fighter. You could argue that the 6/5 is actually better for the most part, I think. But The problem with this is there's not that many good Deathrattles, right? If you look at cards that have Deathrattle, many of them, again, are in Wild. Many of them are rotating out. There are not that many cards that you want to use this battle cry on. So, for that reason, again, probably not going to see as much play in Standard, just because the amount of Deathrattles is not really good enough, right? But yeah, I think it's going to be okay in Wild. It's going to be definitely okay, just because you don't lose anything for this effect. This effect is tacked onto a minion that is already appropriately statted. Like, this being at 5 health is actually huge. Okay, this being at 5 health is actually huge. 5 health is a big break point, and I think the stats are just right on it. It's very, very strong. Its battle cry is very, very strong, but again, if you don't have that many Deathrattle minions, you're just not gonna see play. That's about it. So for that reason, probably not too playable in Standard. In the arena, even if you don't have any Deathrattle minions, it's still a 5 mana 6/5, right? It kills like something like a Pit Fighter, which is, you know, fairly common in arena. It obviously depends on the other legendaries that you get, but again, sometimes you're just gonna get Lorewalker, Cho, and Nat Pago, and Princess Huhuran, and you're gonna pick her and be fairly happy about it, just because, I mean, it's an on-curve minion with an upside, which is pretty good. And the final card of today, we have the Dark Arakkoa, or Arakkoa, not sure. Again, pronunciation is not one of my strong points. It's a 6 mana 5/7 common taunt. Battlecry, give your Cthulhu +3/+3 wherever it is. And that's very interesting. It is. It's very, very interesting. It's past the curve of the Claxi Amber Weaver, so that's a big. It's not that big of a minus, but it's, you know, a con. But the stats on this card are actually very good. You have a 6 mana 5/7 taunt. That's almost an Ancient of War. If you put on like 1 more mana and 3 more life, which is, you know, kind of what it's worth. For the most part, it'll be 2 life. That's worth 1 mana, but you guys get my point. This guy is pretty good, and it's another big taunt. It helps you survive, it helps you get to your Cthulhu, it helps enable Cthulhu synergizing cards. Yeah, it's just really good, I think. Definitely gonna see play in Cthulhu-oriented decks. It's just very strong. Even if you don't run Cthulhu, like, at all, for some reason, you don't have it. Maybe you did not get the promo from the expansion where you actually are guaranteed to open a Cthulhu. This guy is still really good. It's a 6 mana 5/7 taunt. That's really good. The 5 damage is a big break point, so that anything that hits into this will most likely die, just like Ancient of War. And yeah, pretty good card. I like it. Yeah. In the arena, it's not going to be playable just because Cthulhu cards are confirmed to not be available in arena, which I don't know why that is, but I mean, it is what it is, right? And in Wild, I think Cthulhu decks in general are a bit too slow to be in Wild, to be playable in Wild as an archetype. So for that reason, in Wild, probably not going to see too much of this guy. But Standard, pretty good minion. Also, there's something to be said that you have a lot of taunts right now as a druid. You can curve Senjin, right, into something like Druid Claw, into Dark Arakkoa, into Ancient of War, into Ironbark, God forbid, into Lumberer, God forbid. So there's like, Druid is basically the taunt class. You are going to be able to survive as a Druid, which is good because you want to get to your Cthulhu. You want to be able to get to 10 mana consistently. And I think this card fits that fairly well. So, that's it for the review, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Consider slapping the like button if you will. And yeah, let me know what you think of the review in the comments. Did you like the review? Do you like the cards? What are your personal thoughts on the cards, on the expansion as a whole? Let me know. I will be reading all of them as always. And yeah, have a great day, guys. And I will catch you in the next video.